You are listening to Neurosalience, the OHBM podcast.
Welcome to the OHBM Neurosalience podcast. I'm your host, Peter Bannattini. Here we chat about topics and issues related to brain mapping and neuroscience with guests from the field. On this episode, we have Dr. Aina Puce and Dr. Daniel Marguiles, and we'll be discussing all things related to the Organization for Human Brain Mapping, its past, some of its history, some of its interesting development, and its future. So just to introduce our two guests, I've known Aina for about a quarter century, and she's currently the chair of the OHBM Council, or otherwise known as the president of OHBM. And she's the director of Indiana University Imaging Facility and the Elanor Cox Riggs Professor of Psychological and Brain Sciences. So she received her bachelor's in applied science from Swinburne University Institute of Technology in 1981 in Melbourne. That's her dates are. Sorry about that, Aina. Master's in physics at Swinburne and Ph.D. in medicine at the University of Melbourne in 1990. So she carried out her postdoc. I actually remember her working with Schulman's, or actually McCarthy, Greg McCarthy at Yale University from 1993 to 94. And in 94, she became an associate research scientist at Yale. In 98, she moved back to Swinburne briefly. And then in 2002, she came to West Virginia University as a professor of radiology and director of neuroimaging. And finally, she ended up in 2008, where she is now at Indiana University. So she's been incredibly active at OHBM since the very early days and has been, continuously a passionate innovator with regard to many of the initiatives, even including, if we have time, we'll get to it, last year's OHBM Twitter-only meeting called OHBMX that was very successful. So now for Daniel. Dr. Daniel Marguiles is the chair of the OHBM Program Committee. That's the person who oversees all the scientific content of the meeting. And he's currently a tenured professor at the CNRS, or the French National Center for Scientific Research in Paris. In 2005, he received his bachelor's degree at New York University. 2008, his master's from the European Graduate School in, I probably will pronounce this wrong, Saas-Fee, Switzerland. In 2010, he received his PhD from Humboldt University in Berlin. And 2009 through 11, he was a postdoc in the Department of Neurology at Max Planck Institute for Human Cognitive and Brain Sciences in Leipzig. And then in 2011 to 17, he was a junior group leader at the same institute. The same institute, but in the Max Planck Research Group in Neuroanatomy and Connectivity. So importantly, he's also the recipient of the 2018 OHBM Young Investigator Award, as well as, and I just saw this as well, I know only one other person who has this award, the prestigious Otto Hahn Award in 2010. So he's been a pioneer in fMRI connectivity methods throughout his career and has recently produced really novel and penetrating work uncovering and studying the organizational gradient that spans between sensory motor and transmodal areas. This work hints at least to me, it hints at fundamental organizing principles that sort of are being revealed of the brain at least at the spatial scale. And all of this is definitely worth discussing more, but today our focus mostly is OHBM. So with that, OHBM is the Organization for Human Brain Mapping is incredibly thriving. The meeting's been going on since 1995. Things are mostly going well. Of course, there's challenges as they exist, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But so Aina, you and I have been in OHBM since the start. And a few years ago, you wrote a blog post and you're working on papers talking about the history of OHBM. Why don't you try to summarize a little bit the history? And maybe not all the history, but just hitting the high points. That's how it all began.
Very briefly. Thank you, Peter, for asking me to come on the podcast today. And yes, you and I know each other for a long time, right from the start. And the story of OHBM starts well before that first OHBM meeting, and that was due to innovators and leaders in neuroimaging, such as Peter Fox, who organised a series of 8 brain map workshops in San Antonio in the 90s, where he invited the leaders of the neuroimaging field at the time. And these included lots of visionaries from not only the US in neuroimaging and neuroscience, including Leslie Ungerleider, who of course we lost last year, but also people from Europe, innovative neuroimaging scientists from Europe as well. He had NIH funding to hold these workshops, and these meetings were devoted to developing standards for a standardization of space, neuroimaging space, for analysis and reporting. And they also had discussions way back then about open access and neuroimaging archives. And that was kind of proto open science, if you will. And this was visionary stuff. Now, they had a lot of challenges. The technology of the day, didn't enable them to do that. But there was that thinking there already at that time. And in fact, the council, OHBM Council in 2001 wrote an opinion piece about data sharing. And that was article was led by Jonathan Cohen, which of course you and I were on council at the time, and we participated as younger members of the council, but the initiative was led by the older senior scientists of the field. But that brain map meeting of Peter Fox's spawned the first OHBM meeting before OHBM existed, and Bernard Mazayer volunteered at one of those brain map meetings to host the first human brain mapping meeting in Paris. And he did that with Per Roland as well, and Rüdiger Seitz from Düsseldorf. But the meeting was hosted in Paris at the Cité des Sciences et de l'Industrie in the 19th arrondissement in northeast Paris. 820 people went to that, 404 abstracts, and the original plan was for a smaller number of attendees. So all of the organisers were running ragged because the meeting was such an amazing success.
I have to let you know that I regret very much I missed that meeting. I wasn't one of the attendees. I was doing my postdoc at MGH, and they said, "Oh, we'll send you the meeting." And I was like, "I'm too busy. I just got to get this stuff done." And it didn't even occur to me that this was like a historical first meeting. So I've been to the next one.
Well, it was a historical meeting because that meeting was also a satellite meeting for the. It was Brain 95, which was. The Society for Cerebral Blood Flow Metabolisms meeting, as well as it was a meeting around the European Society for Neuroradiology at the time. And I presented an abstract on both intracranial neurophysiology and fMRI at the time. So that was, I remember making a poster for that first meeting.
And it's funny how, at the time that first meeting, OHBM kind of grew with fMRI. There were other techniques that were more common than fMRI at the time at the very beginning. Like you were saying, EEG and PET and other techniques, but fMRI sort of started just a few years beforehand. So there's tons of excitement. So.
Right. And there was no real venue to present that work. And so how that became OHBM became a venue. And then of course the society, the organization as it was known back then, started a few years later when David Van Essen and the council of the day drafted bylaws, and then a series of meetings were born. And so that was an amazing time, very exciting time, and a time of inclusivity because we were trying to include other disciplines, not just fMRI, but there was PET imaging, there was EEG and MEG, and we were trying to break down at the time the silos that existed between disciplines. There were these very small disciplinary meetings, and people didn't go outside their discipline. And so that was a bold move to try and make this organization, as it was known at the time, have a wide umbrella and be inclusive of multiple disciplines.
Yeah. I had that feeling too, not only, especially the inclusiveness. I mean, even though it was small, I think that there were a wide, still somewhat of a diversity of groups scattered around, and it always felt like everyone was kind of supporting each other, and you sort of felt in the early days like kind of a tribe, sort of like, okay, we're all part of this thing together, and these brain mapping initiatives, and it's grown over the years, and we can probably talk a lot about details of how it's grown, but I do feel like it's became, certainly it's gotten larger, but I can't even keep up with all the SIGS and all the various other organizations. It's extremely now, which actually makes it more welcoming for other people as well. I mean, you have these subgroups and these various chapters.
Right. Yeah. Well, the things have changed in the sense that, as you said, Peter, it was very small in its day, and we all knew each other. So everybody knew each other, and we were trying to be, the diversity push at that time was, as I said, disciplinary. We were trying to push that. And but we still had clinical sessions. That first meeting had clinical sessions. It had a clinical session, had an education session. 20% of the attendees were students. Now, of course, we have much higher trainee attendance rate. It's more like 50-60% depending on the meeting. Yeah. So, and now we're trying to push diversity issues in terms of not so much discipline, because I think we've got those disciplines and we could do better than that, but we certainly are much wider with disciplines, but we're pushing diversity initiatives for geographical diversity, for gender and racial diversity as well. And that's a big push now. So that's something that's very different and positive that is happening.
Yeah. So Daniel, before we get into the current program, so what was your first OHBM? What was your impression?
It was back San Francisco, about 12, 13 years ago, I suppose. And I remember that feeling of, being very young in the field, not knowing a lot of folks, but just seeing what a kind of thrilling community spirit there was to the meeting, how exciting it was to interact with people, to meet new folks. And I remember back then thinking, like, if we want to have the best and the brightest in this community, we got to keep this party spirit alive at the conference. And that really dovetails into a lot of the thinking behind the planning of this year's meeting 12, 13 years later.
Yeah, no, and so, right. I mean, you've been also part of the various other organizations as well. I mean, it's sort of these sub-programs. I remember you, so is it true? I mean, you were part of the Brain Arts SIG.
We had this like neuro bureau entity.
The neuro bureau, right.
Yeah, it was sort of operating in the shadows. And So okay, all right. I remember San Francisco as well, and it's funny because there's certain societies where you feel, or even certain fields where you feel it's kind of where the olds kind of eat their young, and they kind of it's very tough to get into, and it's whereas OHBM not perfect, but it's always felt like I've never really felt like there were any barriers to people. You present your poster, people talk to you, and they give suggestions, and that's it, and it's fun. And there's things set up in the meeting that are sort of positive and induce more social activity and more collaborations and things like that. So why don't we actually just get into? I mean, we could always circle back of some of the more interesting history, which we could probably have a 5-hour podcast on that, actually, to be honest. And but why don't we just hit the highlights of this meet? How about this? So why don't we go right into this meeting,
And then maybe trace back as to how things adapted to COVID, and then maybe even before that, some of the advancements over the years, over the history, but starting in the president right now up front. So I've been part of the some of the planning, some of the council meetings, because I'm on the scientific advisory board, but I'm not familiar at all with what's been planned for the virtual meeting this year, and I know that last year was super challenging getting going. But so Daniel, why don't you tell us what is in store?
Well, we're very excited. Needless to say, we're very excited. And I think it's because we, as everyone knows, we really had to rush to pull together a virtual meeting without a lot of notice last year. And there were many challenges that were all very clear. For this year's meeting, we knew from the get-go, this is going to be virtual. We have to deal with it and try and find what are the advantages in that structure that otherwise is not really the ideal way that we'd like to meet together. So I think the bottom line is that what we all agreed on initially is we need to maintain a focus on interaction. A conference is not just about sharing content nowadays. There are plenty of ways for us to be able to share scientific content. What a conference allows is an opportunity for spontaneous, direct interaction across entities for the kinds of opportunities that arise through chance meetings and discussions. And to have that concentrated moment in the year when you can come together and really chat with people and take the time to see what they're up to and discuss current interests and future directions, right? So the first challenge was then, if we want interaction to be at the center of the meeting, how are we going to create that? And we can probably get into this whenever you like, but we've got a new platform that we're in the process of putting together. And what makes it innovative and exciting for this meeting is that unlike a lot of the online conference structures that start from the position of how do we deliver the content, we found a company that designs platforms for custom-made online virtual parties.
Oh, wow.
And that's exactly. And that's the starting point.
Which it kind of is.
That's how I've always felt about it. Right. But then of course the challenge for them becomes, how do we build in all of the key content aspects that we need? But that's available. Those features will come in. But it's much more challenging to find, how do you create a space in which folks can interact in a somewhat spontaneous way and move around and run into people that they maybe don't know, be able to be surprised by posters as they're moving through a poster hall, for instance, in a way that's user-friendly, intuitive, and accommodating to the challenges of everyone having to take time out for this 1 week a year. And in this particular case, sit in front of a computer and interact. So that's been, there are all sorts of fun challenges, it turns out, when you get into the details, but that's the gist of what's going to be happening this year.
Well, I'm actually kind of curious. And I think a lot of people, so like last year they had, it's hard to, like, I know, what was it called? I mean, where you had a little avatar and you would walk around a little bit, and at the GatherTown.
Yeah, exactly.
And I thought, well, maybe that would be interesting to actually have a poster session like GatherTown or something like that. It was a little clunky at the time. I'm sure it's much better now. So I'm kind of curious if it will be something like that entirely, or will it? It captures some of the features of GatherTown in that there is a sense of space. You're moving through different rooms, but there are less of, let's say, the clunky interactive components that are fun initially and then can become a bit frustrating in terms of the constraints. So you can still search for a poster and go to a poster room where there'll be a video chat going with the content and the discussion board. Cool. Aspects like that. Same with all of the features of the meeting. But it essentially, you got it. It's trying to capture the kind of the good side of what GatherTown offers, which is a sense of folks being in a shared space together. It's not us all passively watching videos behind a screen and occasionally chatting. It'll be a lot of video chat components
and almost entirely live interaction.
Okay.
So then, like, the big challenges that come up. Oh, go ahead, Aina, please.
I was just going to say that, as Daniel's saying, there are a lot of challenges, and we've got a technology task force that we put together, and that's very capably headed by Alex Fornito. And we've got many different types of expertise on that. Lots of people putting their heads together, thinking about all of the challenges that we will incur across time zones, across technologies, geographical zones, and things like that. It's not simple to do, right?
So how do you solve how are you solving the time zone issue this year? I mean, there's no perfect solution, but
that was what I was watching. There's a wonderful mini documentary about the challenge of scheduling baseball. It turns out there's this couple that they're great at it, and one of the key points they bring up is that based on the rules and the structure that you have in front of you, you can only get so far. The trick to doing this with expertise is knowing where to break the rules. And so that was part of the challenge here for HBM is there. Unfortunately, we looked at it. There is no time zone where everyone overlaps. You can find maybe there it just doesn't work. And so the trick becomes, where do you start to bend it? And what's the best way to get the most people, but also accommodate the fact that we are trying to improve the diversity, and that includes geographic diversity. How do you facilitate interaction across all different parts of the world with all of the time constraints? So what we decided on is essentially it's going to be 2 blocks per day that are spaced out by 8 hours. And each of those are 4-hour blocks, and they allow for overlap across different time zone sets. So that's the basic schedule. There'll be these 4 hours that happen twice, and hopefully this will provide sufficient opportunity for everyone to be able to directly interact. We've got a few other features in there. That's the core of the meeting.
Okay.
There's been so much discussion. The program committee, we've had a lot of meetings, and Daniel has had brainstorming sessions with everybody how to better do things. And last year we had 3 time zones. That was very challenging for everybody, and the content was really crammed. And so Daniel's idea right from the start was always to have things less crammed and allow for potential time slots so that spontaneous things can develop, and so that there can be interactions in the way that when we have a face-to-face meeting be like. And of course, that's what we didn't do last year, and people missed. So we've been trying to think about that, and Daniel has been really working hard to try and implement that.
Yeah, that's really cool. I mean, last year I think that you had some software, but then you just got some local, the OHBM community people, and who just sort of chipped in and created some really cool things, like ways of putting all the posters in one massive document that you just sort of scroll through, and which is kind of like a poster hall, but not quite. But yeah, it's still tricky. Like one thing I found a little bit creepy about GatherTown is, and the whole thing is, I mean, for all of us, I mean, sure, 20 years it won't be creepy, but it's still kind of, is that you could just put in a person's name and you could just go to them, like wherever they are, you can just find them. It's like, usually the normal social interaction is where you're standing there, and then you're kind of looking for someone, and you kind of see them and you walk towards them, and you might meet someone else. And obviously here it's like, you can just hone in on them, and which is good for certain people, but it's funny. It's something, it will start its own etiquette, I guess, in some sense.
Neuro-stalking, perhaps?
But it's cool. I'm really looking forward to this. I'm really looking forward to OHBM, and I think we're all over the year have become much more comfortable with Zoom, with kind of interacting virtually, and so it will feel more natural no matter what. But then it's the software, the planning, the thoughtfulness of this is getting better.
Well, there are a couple of other things too. The software is open source, and so the idea is to be able to use this in subsequent years and modify it as well. And so this is not just a one-time thing. So we've thought, carefully about that, and the Technology Task Force has thought very carefully about that. So there's that aspect. As you said, Peter, people are now much, much more comfortable with being online, and people know how to use the chat windows. And so there's an online culture now that's developed, and so the interactions can be more vibrant, and so we can capitalize on that, and we can see how those meetings have grown. So I think it'll be a lot better. And then if and when we do go to face-to-face meetings again, we may consider having a hybrid format where people who can't make it to the meeting, and people who are in other countries where travel is difficult can then access parts of the meeting. But I have to quote Lucina Uden, because she said the first time that we get together for a face-to-face meeting, given what Daniel said about the party aspect of it, that meeting is going to be epic.
Yeah, it's going to be funny. It's going to be like the Roaring 20s after the Spanish.
Science all over the place.
Yeah. No, I'm looking for, that will be fun. That'll be fun. But we may never go completely back, right? I mean, you might have some sort of, it seems like a good thing, to have more access to the content in some way.
Yeah, we have to make lemonade out of lemons.
Yeah.
And that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I'm really looking forward to it. So just before we start circling back or whatever, is there anything interesting in the actual scientific content? I know that, you don't have to go through the whole thing, but, we always try to cover, if various areas. Are there certain ones where, some are clinical, some are basic neuroscience, some are mapping? Is there anything that's, not to reveal any names yet as far as who's giving the keynotes or things like that, but I don't know if we know yet, but I don't know if I know.
That information might be out there somewhere already. But I think one of the key, I was looking through the content again, so refreshing myself with what are the focuses that might have emerged this year, both through the symposia as well as the keynotes that we have. And one of the interesting topics that I didn't expect is that there seems to be a big focus on the mesoscale and incorporating that into our various approaches that we use. So the mapping the mesoscale, thinking about the mesoscale in terms of looking at either cognitive function pathways or integrating it into our understanding of anatomy.
Yeah, I'm sorry, just to clarify for, non-OHBM audience, potentially mesoscale is specifically what scale would you define that to be?
And this is what I'm going to be interested to hear. I'm really looking at the titles at the moment, and what I imagine this is going to be doing is thinking about the cortical column level, thinking about the level between the individual cell and the whole brain scale that we're used to talking about more with MRI. And how can we take advantage of all of the knowledge that's been gained through various mapping techniques that are able to address that microscopic scale and incorporate that then into the wider picture of brain function. So I think there's going to be a lot of exciting work coming out on how we can work across these databases that have emerged, different imaging techniques, and begin to combine.
That's cool. That's cool.
The other thing that I might foreshadow and mention too is because we're doing an online meeting, we can do things in a way that we can't do with a face-to-face meeting. So at the program committee level, we have had discussions about maybe having an additional submission of abstracts for people. We've talked about that because people, are always frantically trying to do things for OHBM, they miss out. There's no reason why we can't have another submission. Yeah. We're doing this online. If we were doing it face-to-face, that's really, really hard to do. But let's make the most of this.
Yeah, you can imagine. Yeah.
I think we can announce that officially. I think that is going to happen in some form or another.
Yeah, that's what we talked about and people approved at the program committee. So It's not something that we have announced officially yet, but we're considering how that would work. It hasn't been planned completely, but I just wanted to foreshadow that, because then that would involve people who may be thinking, well, I've missed the boat and I can't submit something for OHBM, but there'll be another chance for them to do that.
I think you would catch a lot. I think that there are a lot of people who, right towards the deadline, I think that there's people are stressed out and just.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing with COVID. Everybody has taken so much longer to do everything. And we're recognizing that. And so that's why we thought that would be a really good thing for people to do. Yeah,
that's great. It'll be interesting to see what comes. I mean, ISMRM used to have that. They used to have abstracts and then some sort of late abstracts that were just sort of submitted at the last minute that were actually all, they were all a little bit less finished, but a lot of interesting content. And so yeah, no, I think that's a great idea. And there's so many things with the virtual meeting that I really like. I mean, I like just to I don't like the fact that it's still sort of being on the computer. It's so easy to multitask, and it's different from sitting and just watching, where you're forced to pay attention. However, it's nice to be able to have access to the online content immediately and go back and say, oh, what did that person say that I wasn't quite sure? You could just go right back and listen to it again. So that's nice.
I think the online thing, that it's really nice that something that doesn't happen at a face-to-face meeting is what happens in the chat. And so co-authors are chatting. If there is a live talk, co-authors of that author who's presenting are chatting with people in the audience, swapping, references, giving people preprints and reference information, and that sharing, the background behind the work, and that's what I found incredibly stimulating last year at OHBM. In that it was what was happening in the chat window while the presenter was presenting live. That was
that's cool.
Priceless.
That's cool. And then everyone can see it. It's like you're whispering, but really loudly, and but you're not really being distracting. So it's both whispering loud, sharing with everyone, but not being distracting at the same time. So that's kind of fun, right? That's neat. But it's interesting also, like you mentioned the mesoscale. I mean, that's kind of like, it's where some of the research of, we're doing, layer fMRI stuff, but it is interesting how the brain, so this is kind of an important point that, with OHBM, the whole thing started with, we're trying to sort of, we start with like EEG and PET, which is sort of, two extremes. One's fast and low resolution, one's a little bit higher resolution, but very, very slow and invasive. But then we're slowly kind of honing in, filling in the gaps of all the spatial scales and finding like meaning and relevance across each scale. And then trying to, understand the brain, we have to sort of connect all these scales.
And just the challenges of multimodal data and new techniques, MEG at room temperature. I saw a paper on a 400 channel system of optically pumped magnetometers the other day. That's where things are going. That's incredibly exciting. And then just also the other thing that's happening in the field is just putting the brain back in the body. People are measuring other bodily signals. And the poor old brain has had a hard time. It's just like that, in Young Frankenstein, that brain sitting in a jar, Abby normal on it, right? It's been lonely all this time, and now we can try and connect some of those other bodily signals and those other organ systems that interact with it. And I think that's a really big thing that's happening in the field as well today. And I'm really excited about that. And we're starting to see stuff like that at this meeting too.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting to see how far it can go. I mean, you have entire social networks that you're connected to in some sense, and it could, determines a lot of aspects of brain function. And yeah, so great. All right, so just to back up a little bit to some of the challenges. So obviously COVID was a big challenge with OHBM, but it was sort of, I remember, we had Rome in 2019, but the problem was in Singapore and Vancouver were both changed at the last minute. If you want to talk about that a little bit, that's, in the impact it had on OHBM. I don't know if Daniel, you were part of that. You may have been part of some aspect, but still, yeah. I don't know. I don't even know if you were on council, but still,
I was on program committee. I wasn't on council, but I was on program committee, and so we were reeling with the same kinds of changes because of sponsors and the local organising committee has they have a problem as well, and it's just really makes things difficult. And one of the things that we have, which sometimes is a blessing and a curse, is the way we manage our affairs. We have bylaws that also have set financial constraints on us, that we have to have a certain reserve, a financial reserve. And this has been something that, we've come a little bit of, had some heat over that, because people are saying, well, you've got resources and, you're sitting on them. Well, yes and no, because you have to have enough resources to have upfront be able to mount a meeting, because the finances come from registrations and that come in later. Now, so that's one aspect. The second aspect is when you are holding a meeting, you have to have a very hefty deposit to a convention centre. If you have to change your meeting venue, sometimes you lose that deposit. And because of those challenges that we had with the Zika virus, because we didn't go to Puerto Rico, we went to Vancouver.
We changed it it was like 4 months before the meeting or something like that, right?
Right. And so that deposit was lost. And so that there are financial implications of making decisions like that. They pale into insignificance, because what's the main consideration is the safety and well-being of the members of our society. So that is the number one consideration. Yeah. But that said, it also puts a constraint on our finances. And so that's what happened over the three meetings in a row, which if you were playing the lottery, you'd never predict something like that. Yeah. And that's what's happened to us. And the folks in Seoul too, they were so excited about, trying to have their meeting too. And fortunately, we've been able to reschedule with them. The folks at the convention centre in Montreal this year were very good. They're looking forward to us coming back there when I think it's, 2023? I think we said we were popping back there. So they're happy, we're happy. So we were able to resolve those things, but that was very difficult.
Yeah.
For the previous council.
Yeah, I always felt that the whole Zika virus scare was a little bit easier to make a decision about, but in Korea, it was really a strange thing. You had the tensions with North Korea, and you didn't know what the heck. And all the people in Korea were like, "Oh, nothing's going to happen. Don't worry about it." And no, you just don't know. So,
well, my understanding was, and I wasn't on council at the time, but my understanding was that sponsors had expressed concern about the venue and also some of the membership, and based on those concerns, council did. Consider changing the venue. Now, that said, there was an irony there, because as we all laughed, we were all in Singapore, and then that political saber rattling that was happened in Seoul actually ended up in Singapore.
I know. That's the irony. That's right.
There you have it. But we've been back to meeting changes. We started a dialogue with our Korean colleagues right from the outset after our first virtual meeting. So when at the end of last summer, and not even actually during last summer, we were already in dialogue with our Korean colleagues and the local organising committee, and we let them, as council, make the decision on what they would like to do, because they are the ones who are going to be, bearing the brunt of it. And they elected to wait and to go virtual. And we and council were totally good with that, and I think they made the right decision. And so that gave us time to plan. And so council then immediately launched a technology task force, and we've been working and planning right from the outset there. So
yeah,
it's been good.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And yeah, I'm looking forward to it. And so other challenges before that. So I know that's what were some of the challenges? I tried to just in our last 15 minutes or so, or 10 minutes or so, or some of the big accomplishments. I mean, like, for instance, Florence was kind of nice. In 2006, it came to Florence. The society broke 3,000 people for the first time, and that was hugely successful. Other. Well,
2016, we became a society officially.
That's right.
And in doing that, we were able to now spawn other initiatives that are part of the society, and including, as you've had on a podcast already before, Aperture. So we are now doing things and having education programs and outreach activities will now also be able to happen in a way that didn't happen before.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm excited about.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, most people don't, and including myself, I didn't really fully appreciate the difference between an organization and a society. And I remember, believe it or not, for Koviak, back in the town hall meeting, we used to have our big debates in the town hall meeting, organizing for nothing. I mean, or maybe he just wanted a group of people. I don't know. I forgot the
No,
gist.
I think there were a couple of issues behind his thinking. I didn't agree with his suggestion at the time, but I think I know what he was thinking about. He was concerned at the time that there would be competition with other societies.
Right.
There was a Society for Cerebral Blood Flow and Metabolism. There was a Society for Neuroscience. There was FENS, of course. And so he was concerned about that. The second thing he was concerned about was, and this was a tricky one, politically tricky one, because we had Human Brain Mapping, the journal, had started up, and Neuroimage, the journal, had started up, both providing a wonderful publishing venue, which for a new discipline like fMRI at the time, there was no place for people to publish.
Right.
So these were monumental things. And so, of course, Peter Fox started Human Brain Mapping, and we're very indebted to him. And we're also indebted to people like Richard Frikowiak, John Maziotta, and Art Toga, who took an existing journal at the time, Neuroimage, and converted it to a brain mapping journal. And so I think that part of the concern that Richard had at the time was, if we make it a society, then societies often have a journal that is one journal that's associated with it, and that would have put tensions on a young discipline.
Yeah, that was pretty wise. I kind of agree with sort of letting things happen naturally. And
but that said, that was a pretty cantankerous set of town hall meetings. And Alan Evans, I remember, he put a tank helmet on at the podium.
Yes,
I remember that meeting. But that's why. And so now it seems sort of trivial, but now we have gone we've taken a bold step as a society, and now we're launching an online journal ourselves. Yeah. Not to say that we don't appreciate and support human brain mapping and neuroimage. And I mean, Peter and I have been on the editorial staff.
Right.
And Peter was editor-in-chief, and I was a senior editor at Neuroimage, and I support those, and I support human brain mapping too. They are wonderful vehicles for publishing our work.
Yeah, and not only that, I mean, there's sort of this growth of and a maturity of other journals, both open
Brain
access.
structure and function, which the late Carl Ziller started. Brain topography, which is very ably edited by Christophe Michel as an editor-in-chief. And so we have now a set of journals that we didn't have before, and that's really, really exciting. So early career researchers can, at least publish their work there. And of course, we now have preprints, and we have open science in a way that when all of this started, that didn't exist.
Yeah.
People were talking about open science and doing things. And for me, that's incredibly satisfying, thinking about where we've gone in 25 years.
And that actually, I mean, that's what I just want to maybe, I mean, as we get close to the end, that's exactly, there's certain things that a society is good for that helps to catalyze the field. I mean, the whole goal is to, the problem with science is that you write your paper and people read it and they try to reproduce it, and it doesn't really get disseminated or used as quickly as maybe it could. But with OHBM, it's like they try to set standards for sharing. They try to have open access for sharing, and it's all about sort of, garnering the world to sort of work together in a way that's effective.
Well, and that those Cobitus committees, the first one was so well chaired by Tom Nichols, led the way for MRI-related data, and then Cyril Pernet and I co-chaired the MEEG one. We've now produced documents which need, updating periodically, but that was grassroots-led, initiatives. That's the power of what we can all do together. Yeah. And so that's, for me, is an amazing thing.
Yeah.
And the other thing that one thing that I need to say is that as I give up my council chair position at the end of the upcoming meeting, Randy Golub comes in, and she is also a champion for open science and has a lot of innovative ideas and has worked a lot with the SIGS. And she is tasked with our new strategic plan for 5 years. We would have done it last year, but because COVID happened, we put it off. But we will be in November, December meeting to make a new strategic plan for activities for the next 5 years.
Okay, well, that's exciting as well. And actually, one of the things I noticed that has changed about OHBM as well is that now, as I get older, I feel like it's been getting younger, and the students actually have more of a voice. I feel students and postdocs and young professors as well. I think in the early days, I think it was a lot of these already established scientists who've gone on from other fields. And so it's sort of like you felt like, if you're a student, you were just sort of second voice. But here, I think the students definitely are kind of dictating a lot of the content and the rhythm.
Well, the other thing too, which is nice for me, just when you mentioned about when OHBM was first set up, it is very hard to set up a society or an organization like that. And so the senior scientists who were leaders and visionaries of the day did that. But what they did was they also involved us, who are young ones. And so there was you and me, and there was Randy Buckner and Anders Dale and Kia Nobre, right? We were the young ones on that committee. And it's funny now, because when we look back now, we are the oldies.
Yeah.
And you know what? I have to say, I'm having the time of my life because I enjoy working with younger scientists.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's just great. And that's what we try and keep going. Council has always been a mixture of the young and the old. And to really fully do things well, it has to stay that way. And that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah. Yeah. So Daniel, what's your perspective on, obviously you're You're sort of in between. You're not young. You're not old.
Man. That's the worst.
Or you're still young. Of course you're young.
But I'm like, I would put in perspective, it'll be several months before I get the COVID vaccine. So for whatever that's worth. It's been super exciting. You turn around one day and you're sitting at that table that you were really hoping to one day be able to participate in. And I've had the pleasure of being able to do that with my dearest friends in the community, right? Pierre Bellec and Cameron Craddock, who also were on council, and to be able to grow up in our careers with the organization, be able to contribute at the level that we're able to now, it's been super exciting and a real thrill.
Yeah. And I have to say, it's really injected. I think that, it's funny, the energy and the scale with kind of what your group is doing. You're old enough that you can start taking broad. You have broad projects. They're all really. I'm always impressed with your work, but in general, along the lines of what Cameron Craddock does and other people, like, oh, let's start, these hackathons, or let's. Starting that, and this is where I feel old, because when hackathons first started, I'm like, well, what's the goal? What? But I'm kind of getting it now. That good things come from coming together and
that's right.
Problems in the fly.
Yeah.
And so that's great. And those are things that are totally, your sort of generation, if you can call it a generation. It's sort of like, 5-year generation periods. But yeah, all right. Well, and certainly as we near the end of our time here, I think about all the things you could talk about with the history of OHBM that are really, sort of fun stories and some educational stories and some maybe interesting stories as every society and grows and has growing pains and grapples with things. But I think we're in a healthy state, a really healthy state, not only organizationally, and not only, in terms of the science, but also in terms of our momentum. I think that brain mapping, I always feel that brain mapping is kind of still just getting started. I kind of still feel like at the stage where we're just beginning to get a sense of the question. It's like you're mapping. But then you're trying to make a sense of what's actually are the principles of organization. As Daniel is one of the people who do that best. So yeah, we're just beginning, and brain mapping is becoming more relevant everywhere. And I'm just hoping that it becomes more clinically applicable, which, it's all these domains to enter into, which OHBM can help. So,
and it's really nice because our abstracts are, 40% of our abstracts are clinical, and that's really encouraging for the future.
Yes. So once again, when is the meeting being held? Just so that everyone knows. Hopefully this podcast will be, I'm sure it will be out within a month or so, but
the meeting is definitely in June.
In June. It's
definitely in June. The 21st and 25th.
Okay.
Does that sound about right?
Yeah, I think that sounds right.
Good.
Yeah. So great. Then I think that with that, I'd just like to, thank Aina. I feel like we just started our conversation, but just for the sake of time, and of course it's midnight now in Paris where we're talking to Daniel. And thank you both for coming on, and I'm excited about OHBM. And thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ben.
All right, thanks.